Hey guys, what's going on? It's Shatterpoint back with another video, and in this one we're going to be talking about Batman the Animated Series, episode Deep Freeze. Batman the Animated Series was the series that was done in 1992 and still stands as one of the best interpretations of the character that has ever been seen. So our story starts on Arkham Island, where off the shore we see a robot come out of the water and start to walk towards Arkham Asylum. The guards notice the giant robot breaking through all of the defenses entering Arkham Asylum, and they start to shoot at it and throw grenades at it. Though these efforts to stop the robot have no effect on it, and the robot easily takes out the guards and continues to make his way towards the asylum. We then see Victor freeze inside of his cell, waking up from sleep due to the distant sounds of gunfire and the distant impact of the grenades. Victor then looks out the window of his cell to see the robot approaching the asylum, and he says to himself, "Impressive." The robot makes his way towards Victor's cell window, and Victor runs away from the window and tries to call a guard. The robot breaks into Victor's cell, and while Victor is panic-stricken and screaming for help, the robot takes him. The scene then goes to the Batcave, where Batman, Robin, and Alfred are reviewing the security footage of Victor's cell. Robin says, "You gotta give him credit, that's the most original breakout this year." Batman, reviewing the security footage, says, "Yes, but I don't think Victor was behind it. Look at the expression of fear on his face. That's not easy to fake, especially for someone that claims to be dead to emotions." Freeze was taken against his will, and by someone with an expertise in robotics. Robin says that maybe we should pay a visit to our own robotics expert. Batman and Robin leave to go to the apartment of Carl Rossum. When they get there, they're greeted by a weird Batmite-looking robot toy. The robot says, "I'm your biggest fan," and then kisses Robin on the cheek, then malfunctions and falls to the floor. Carl Rossum then comes out of his apartment to pick up the toy and then goes back into his apartment. Batman and Robin follow, and Carl Rossum says, "Never could get the thing to work." Batman says, "Cute toy, Carl," and then Carl says, "You know I'm out of the robot business, Batman," and then tosses the Batmite robot away. "All I make now are robots to keep me company." Robin then holds up a picture of the robot that broke out Freeze from Arkham and says, "Like this guy?" Carl takes the picture from Robin and says, "Well, if it isn't old M9, Batman says, "He's one of yours?" And Carl says, "Not really. I once made a prototype for Grant Walker." Robin says, "The guy that makes all those theme parks?" Carl says, "Yep, I was originally one of his visionaries. I designed the animatronics that he put in his park attractions. Though it looks like Grant's boys pumped up the design a bit." Batman says, "I wonder how improved these robots are, and why one of them went to go and kidnap Mr. Freeze." The scene then goes to one of Grant Walker's buildings, where the robot that kidnapped Mr. Freeze enters through a secret underwater entrance. Once inside, the robot spits out Victor Freeze, and then he looks around and says to himself, "Impressive." Grant Walker, standing nearby, says, "Impressive? That's all you can say? Though I shouldn't be surprised. I've made it a habit of studying up on your chilly history." Victor says to him, "And you are?" Grant says, "Grant Walker at your service, and this is Oceana, my prototype vision of the future. A vision that you shall help make a reality." Victor says, "Doubtful." Grant says, "We'll see," and then he says to his robot, "Make sure our guest is comfortable," and the robot takes away Victor. One of the security guards calls Grant and says, "We have an unauthorized vehicle approaching the building." Grant says, "We can't have interference at this stage. Dispatch the usual deterrents." The scene then goes to Gotham Bay, where we see Batman and Robin approaching the building using the Batboat. Robin says to Batman, "I can't see why a theme park mobile would be interested in kidnapping Mr. Freeze." Batman says, "People like Walker are obsessed with getting their own way, and they don't let things like the law stop them." Robin says, "I'm picking something up on the scanner. 3 small objects, coming at us fast." We then see 3 torpedoes coming at the Batboat. Batman evades one of the torpedoes, but the other 2 hit the Batboat and blow it up. The scene then goes to inside the building, where we see the security guard telling Grant that the threat has been neutralized. The scene then goes back to Gotham Bay, where we find out that Batman and Robin ejected from the Batboat. Robin says to Batman, "Well, it looks like we're gonna be swimming home," and Batman says, "Not before we have a chat with Mr. Walker." Batman and Robin go underwater to find an entrance into Walker's building. The The scene goes to inside Walker's building where we now see Mr. Freeze and he's in his freeze suit. Walker and his robot are standing nearby and Walker says to Freeze, "I think you'll find that suit is a perfect replica of your original, even the freeze gun works." Victor then freezes Walker's robot and Walker says to him, "Please, just hear me out. In your frozen state, you age much slower than a regular human. You're practically immortal." Victor says, "Yes, eternal life trapped in this wretched shell. What a miserable joke." Grant says to Freeze, "Yes, miserable for you, but a godsend to me. Look at me, I'm an old man. I've achieved so much in my life, but there's still so much to do. I want to become like you, a being of eternal cold." Victor says to him, "You're insane," and Grant says, "Only you know how to replicate the accident that caused you to be what you are, what I long to become." Freeze grabs Grant and says, "You want to be like me? Abandoned and alone? Prisoner to a world you can see but never touch?" Freeze drops Grant and says, "Old and infirm as you are, I would trade 1,000 of my frozen years for your worst day." Grant says, "Actually, I had another type of swap in mind." Grant presses a button that pulls back a curtain, and behind the curtain we see Nora Freeze in a cryo chamber. When Freeze sees her, he starts to walk towards her, and Grant says, "A few years ago I invested in GothCorp and I put up money towards that cryogenics program. I trust that you know the woman behind the glass." Freeze, now right in front of the cryo chamber, puts his hands to the glass and says, "My wife." Grant says, "The GothCorp execs think that she perished in the fire, but I had my men get her from the wreckage. I have the technology to save her. All you have to do is grant my wish." Mr. Freeze then says to him, "Very well." The scene goes to the side of the building where we see Batman and Robin climbing up, and they make their way towards a stadium. At the stadium, there's a giant projection of Grant Walker, and he's speaking to a large group of people. He says to the group of people, "Thanks to all of our hard work, Oceana is nearly up and running." Most people think that Oceana is just another theme park, but we know better. Things in Gotham City are getting worse. Crime, violence. This all keeps up, it'll be the end of the world. That's why I've decided to build a new city, a Garden of Eden you might say, where all sorts of new people can spring. And of course, you can't have spring without a little bit of winter. About 5 years of it, I would say. We then see through a slideshow that Walker has plans to freeze Gotham City. Walker says, "Don't worry, we'll be warm inside Oceana City, but as for the people outside, it's sad, but they brought this on themselves." Robin says, "He's all heart, isn't he?" And then Batman says, "Walker is a madman." Two security robots grab Batman and Robin. The security robots take Batman and Robin in front of the giant projection of Walker for the entire stadium to see. Batman says, "We've seen your vision of the future, Walker." And Walker says, "My future will have no crime, violence, or pain." Robin says, "You can add free will to that list too." Walker says, "A small price to pay for order." And Batman says, "For your order, for your select few." Walker says, "Excuse me, but I fail to see the problem with that," and then his projection fades away. The security robots then take Batman and Robin to Mr. Freeze. When Batman sees Freeze, he says to him, "I don't know what Walker promised you, but you can't go through with this." Freeze says, "I have no choice," and then shoots Batman and Robin with his freeze gun, freezing them in a block of ice. A giant robot takes them to a room where Walker is about to change himself to be like Mr. Freeze. Walker says to them, "I thought you'd like to enjoy the show," and then says to Mr. Freeze, who is across the room at a computer, "How are we doing?" Mr. Freeze says to him, "Ready." Walker says, "Let's do it," and then doctors put the freeze suit on him and strap him to a chair. Mr. Freeze initiates the same process that made him how he is onto Grant, and Grant successfully becomes like Mr. Freeze. The doctors say to Grant, "Once Project Deep Freeze is completed, you won't need the suit anymore." Grant says to them, "Well, let's get started. Are you coming, Freeze?" Victor says to Grant, "I've done what you wanted, now leave me alone with my wife." Batman says to Freeze, "You can't let Grant do this, billions will perish." Freeze says, "That is not my concern, all that matters is that I have my wife, and the means to restore her." Batman says, "She'll wake up in a dead, frozen world that you helped destroy. She'll hate you for that." Freeze says, "Silence," and Batman says, "You think you're alone now? Wait until she finds out the truth." Freeze now screams at Batman and says, "I said silence," and then shoots Batman and Robin with his freeze gun. Freeze turns to Nora's cryo chamber, puts his hand on the glass, and says to himself, "Forgive me." Freeze walks towards Batman and Robin, breaks them free of the ice, and says to them, "Come, there is much to do." The scene then goes to deeper into Walker's building, where we focus in on Grant walking with one of his colleagues. The colleague says to Grant, "The freeze cannon is ready." Freeze then comes out of an elevator and walks towards Grant. Walker says to him, "So you've decided to join us after all, my friend." Victor freezes the robots that are about to fire the cryo cannon, and Grant says to him, "Wait, what are you doing?" Grant orders one of his giant robots to attack Freeze, and then Robin jumps on the back of the robot. Batman shows up, and then Batman and Robin take out the robots. Victor throws Grant into a vat of cryochemicals and then continues to disable the cannon. Grant crawls out of the vat, grabs a pipe, and then hits Victor with it. Grant says, "This is my dream, my vision. I cheated death to make it real, and you can't stop me." Victor says, "Your dream dies now," and then shoots Grant with his freeze gun, encasing him in ice, leaving his head free though. Victor goes on to overload the main core of the freeze gun, and Grant says to Victor, "What are you doing? A main overload will destroy my city." Victor looks at him and says, "Exactly," and then shoots his head with the freeze gun, encasing it in ice. A giant projection of Mr. Freeze then appears in front of all of the citizens of Oceana City. Victor says to them, "Your city is doomed. If you value your lives, you'll evacuate now." Icicles then burst out of the ground. The entire city evacuates, and then Batman tells Mr. Freeze to evacuate as well. Freeze says to him, "No, I'm staying with my wife." Batman insists that he evacuates with them, and then Mr. Freeze shoots Robin with his freeze gun and says, "I'm the least of your worries. Take the boy and go." We now see Batman driving Robin away in an evacuation boat along with the other evacuation boats, and Oceana City is destroyed. The scene then goes to the Batcave, where Dick Grayson is sitting at a table, now free from the ice, and Alfred is pouring him a cup of tea. Dick says, "If I spent any more time in that immersion tank, I'd be growing gills." Bruce, who is sitting nearby, says, "I'm just glad I got you back here in time." Dick says, "Thanks. For a moment I thought I'd be living life like Grant, trapped in a block of ice for the rest of my life." "Do you think we've seen the last of Mr. Freeze?" Bruce says, "I'm not sure, but if his condition has made him immortal, we probably haven't seen the last of him." The scene then goes to somewhere in the ocean where there's a block of ice floating around, and inside the block of ice is Nora Freeze and Mr. Freeze. Victor puts his hand on the glass of the cryo chamber. And that brings this story to an end. If you enjoyed, please leave a like, share, and subscribe, and when you do, make sure you hit the bell so you get notified whenever I do drop a video, and I will see you guys in the next one.